the object palette, the same place you drag a button or a slider out of, and you drag out a view controller. And when you drag it out, it'll be a generic view controller. In other words, its class will be UI view controller, and it'll be blank, obviously. Then you go create your subclass of UI view controller. Okay? In this case, in the demo I just did, I created a subclass of a class I already had, but you can create a direct subclass of UI view controller. And then you go and inspect it with the attributes inspector, and you set its class. That's it. That's how you drag a new MVC in and create one for your app. So it's easy to add MVCs. Now, once you have an MVC added, you can put things in its view, buttons and labels and stuff, and you can hook up outlets and actions and all that stuff to create a second MVC, or a third or fourth or fifth. A large app might have 100 MVCs in it, okay, or more. So you got all these MVCs. How do you present them to the user? Okay, well, there's a number of ways to do it, but the fundamental answer is you use a controller whose view is other MVCs. Let that sink in a little, okay? So I could have an MVC that has a controller, like all MVCs. The view of that controller is other MVCs. This is the kind of conceptual way we're going to put multiple MVCs. Now I'm going to talk about two classes provided by iOS today, two controllers whose view is other MVCs. One is UI tab bar controller. You're used to that. It's got tabs along the bottom. Every time you click on a tab, you see a different MVC's view. Okay? Couldn't be simpler. That's the simplest, way to get multiple MVCs on screen. And then I'm going to spend more time talking about Uinavigationcontroller, which is the thing where you have something on screen and you click on a button or something that's on screen and a new view slides in. Okay? And then you maybe click again and another one slides in, and then there's a back button and you can back up. So go down and back up. It's when you want to drill down information or back up. Okay, so that one's a little more complicated. And that's what I'm going to spend most of the time on today. Now, there's other ways to put multiple MVCs on screen, popovers on iPad, and modal presentations. I'm not going to talk about those today. We will cover them all in the next few weeks. Okay, I'm just trying to meter this out to you in bite-sized chunks. All right, so let's talk about Uinavigationcontroller. So a great app to look at that uses Uinavigationcontroller is the calendar app. So here's the calendar app at its top level. You can see it's basically a year, an entire year. Today's date is selected, the little red dot in there. That big gray dot is supposed to be the finger. You're going to see it touching various spaces as we go through these slides. And we use a Uinavigationcontroller when we have a bunch of stuff on screen and we want to show the user more detailed, more information. Okay? That's generally what the navigation. Now, it's very common to want to do that, where you're kind of showing high-level information and you want to show more detail, more detail. So the calendar app, if you go over to the day with your finger and you touch, then a month view slides in. Okay? So all of that happened in a single MVC, which was a Uinavigationcontroller's MVC. Okay? So the purple, or the light blue, whatever color that looks like to you on the screen, that is the view of a Uinavigationcontroller-based MVC. Okay? Now, inside there's another MVC's view, the month view. So the little yellow area is another MVC's view. Okay? And what used to be in there was a year MVC view, which was yet another MVC. Okay? So you can see how it's embedded. And not only is it embedded, but the navigation controller is kind of controlling its own UI based on what happens to be embedded at the time. And so I could click on the day, and a day view comes in. So this is a day MVC. So this is 4 MVCs we've seen here. The surrounding navigation controller one, and now 3 separate year, month, and day MVCs that are being shown in here. Okay? So let's take a look. Of course, we can click again and now get the details for an event. So there's 5 MVCs that we've seen. So let's look at the components of this Uinavigationcontroller. So at the top, there's this light gray bar that stayed on the screen, you notice, for all of these MVCs as they come swiping in. Okay, but it changed slightly as they all swiped in. So let's look at all the parts. There's 3 major parts there of that navigation bar. First is the title. Okay, event details. You'll notice that the month and the day, actually I don't even think they had titles, which is perfectly legal. This says event details because the navigation controller is basically asking the embedded controller, the calendar event MVC, what's your title? And then it gets that, and it puts that at the top. You can also set that title in your storyboard if you want to, okay? But it's associated, that title's associated with what's inside, what's embedded in the navigation controller. And it changes as things slide in, okay? Also, we have the buttons on the right here. So there's only one button here, Edit, but if you remember back to the month and day, there were actually two buttons, like a little plus sign to add an event, maybe, and a little magnifying glass to search, things like that. So you can actually have multiple buttons here. That's why it's an NS array. Now, these buttons are not UI buttons. They're UI bar button items, okay, kind of lightweight buttons. And the navigation controller figures out which ones to put there by asking the embedded view for an object called navigation item. So all UI view controllers have this property navigation item, and it returns this object that has some stuff in there like right bar button items, which is an array. Okay, everyone understand the property notation I'm using there? Navigation item dot right bar buttons. I'm getting that from the embedded view, you know, the day view or the month view or whatever. That's what's determining the buttons that are up there. This back button over here on the left, if I click that button, it's going to go back to the last thing that was there, which in this case was the day view. All right? And that's automatically done by UI Navigation Controller. And the word it's going to use there is, if it'll fit, the title of the previous MVC. So in this case, day works, it fits. It can also be set, because I don't know that the day MVC actually had a title that said day. It might have, but I don't think so. So it can be set. Also, if it doesn't fit, it'll just say the word back. Okay, so you'll see that sometimes. But the user knows that that upper left-hand corner is how they go back. So they've drilled down and they can go back. And if I click on that back button, obviously I'm going to go back to the day. If I click again, I'm going back to the month. All right, so that's the back button. Now down at the bottom, you see there's a little light gray bar there. That's not always there. That wasn't there on the calendar event view, MVC, by the way. This is just a bunch of UI bar button items that, again, the navigation controller only displays if the embedded MVC's view says that it wants them. Okay? And there's another property for that called toolbar items. So the navigation controller calls toolbar items on the embedded view controller, and it returns an NS array of UI bar button items, and it puts them in the bottom. And if the embedded view controller doesn't want any bar buttons at the bottom, then it just animates that gray thing away. And then animates it back if you navigate back to one that does. So everyone understand the components of UI Navigation Controller? Okay, so now let's talk about how this thing works. Okay, we know the parts of it. I'm going to do this kind of in an MVC-like view of this. So here I have an MVC, right? You recognize this from the very first lecture, right? And let's say I have more features than I can fit on screen. So I've got the extra views and buttons and stuff I want to put on screen, but they just won't fit. Okay, so what do? Well, like I said, we create a second MVC. Now what's really important to understand here is that MVCs need to be independent. Okay, so this second MVC has to encapsulate some amount of functionality, and it has to be able to be set up, prepared to be on screen, and then it has to be able to run by itself. Okay, why is that? That's because this MVC is going to serve as the view of another MVC. And remember from the MVC discussion that the views can't really talk back to their controllers. The controllers can talk to the view. The only way the view can talk back is by this blind structured communication like target action and things like that. And there is blind structured communication, delegation basically we talked about, for an MVC, part of a view, to talk back, but it's much more complicated, and usually we try to avoid it. We really want to set this MVC up and have it live on its own. Okay? That's really important to try and design. It's really just part of object-oriented programming to encapsulate things. So this MVC wants to be encapsulated. It wants to have its own life. Okay? So let's talk about then how UI Navigation Controller comes into this. If the second MVC, what it wants to show is more detail of the first MVC, then a UI Navigation Controller is appropriate. All right? A UI Navigation Controller looks like this. It's an MVC. Its controller is the UI Navigation Controller. Its view is this kind of white rectangular thing with a gray bar at the top and possibly a gray bar at the bottom. And it includes a root view controller, which is a special outlet that comes out that points to the controller of the MVC that's going to appear in the navigation controller when it starts up. It's root view controller. Okay? So when you set that to be this MVC, the navigation controller is going to look like this. It's going to put the view of that root view controller's MVC embedded inside of its view. Right? Everyone understand that? Okay? Now, if you then have some button or something inside this view, or maybe in the bar at the top that wants to give that more detail and have this other MVC provides, you click on that button and it slides in the view for this other MVC, okay, and puts a back button there, as you see. Now, again, when the navigation controller is in this state, okay, the MVC that's on the left kind of wants to be quiet. It doesn't want to be doing anything, okay? It's not really involved right now. The MVC on the right is completely in control, okay? And so it should be doing everything it's doing on its own, independently. Now, of course, that little back button, which automatically appears when you do this, we're going to talk about, by the way, how to make this happen to go to another MVC. This little back button, when you press it, it's obviously just going to move back to the original one, and then this MVC is now alive again. What happened to the MVC on the right when we click the back button? The answer is it got deallocated from the heap. Okay? This is an important thing to understand as well. Okay? That MVC on the right got unfreeze-dried from the storyboard when we put it on screen, and when it went back off screen, it got deallocated. Okay? Every time we push a new thing onto a new Uinavigation controller, we're creating a new one from the storyboard. Okay? We're instantiating a new one in the heap, and every time we go back and it goes away, it's deallocated. So these MVCs need to know how to come to life, be prepared to come on screen, do what they do, finish what they've done, save whatever work it is, and then just go away. Okay? That is the model. Some of you will be confused by that. You'll think, oh, what happened to all my data? It's gone. Well, because it got deallocated, right? Because that's what happens when you do back. Okay, so if there's any data in there that needs to stay, you need to save it somewhere. Okay? And you could do it by communicating back to the MVC that pushed you on screen, but you have to do it with that blind structured communication. And we'll do that later in the quarter. Okay? You won't have to do that for this assignment whatsoever. Okay, so that's basically how it works. Now let's talk a little bit about that pushing. How do we make a second MVC appear on screen? How do we make it do that sliding in thing? Well, the answer is we use what's called a segue. Okay, segues are very important to understand in this class. A segue is just when you're going to move or segue from one MVC to another. Okay, that's what a segue is about. And the segue that's involved in a UI navigation controller is called a push segue. We kind of think of the navigation controller as we push a new MVC into the front, then maybe push another one, and then we pop back when we hit back button. Okay, that's the terminology we use, but it's called a push segue. So let me talk about how to set up a push segue first, and then we'll show you how to put the whole thing into a navigation controller.